everybody, and welcome back to 6 Degrees of Associations in 2022. Happy New Year to everybody. Happy New Year to you, Lucas, and to you, Lowell.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Aaron.
Yes, we're kicking off. I can't believe this is now technically our third year, Lucas, doing this, because we did start in 2019, but it's only been about 18 months. So I can't, it's kind of hard to wrap our brains
like
around.
we have in everything else.
Yeah. And we're coming to you live in the middle of the Omicron COVID, where every one of us had a story about that, and a snowstorm, epic snowstorm in DC, and a windstorm down here in Georgia. So everyone's just hopefully going to bear with us if there's any technical difficulties as we make our way through this particular episode. But we're excited to kick off 2022 with a really interesting guest. I mean, we've always had very interesting guests, but Lowell Aplebaum comes to us from being recommended by Jamie Bollier. We're going to go with that pronunciation. We're all trying to remember the French way of saying that. But she was great to recommend quite a few people. And Lowell, you and I got to connect right before the holidays and had a really interesting conversation. So I'm so excited to dig into your topic of expertise, or topics, I should say. Before we go too much further, would you mind just sharing a little bit more about your background with the audience?
Sure. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I've been in the nonprofit association space for about 12 years now, as inside organizations, doing everything from membership and component relations to professional development and a COO. And for the past 5 years, I've had my own company, Vista Cova, that we do facilitation. I'm a certified professional facilitator, and we do strategic planning and governance review and board development. We work with about 80 to 90 associations a year of all shapes, sizes, flavors, and love working with mission-focused organizations on that.
That's awesome. You know, it's so interesting. I actually also just saw in the paper this morning around governance, specifically talking about board of directors, that a lot of organizations and colleges and universities are actually starting to create programming to teach and coach individuals how to become board members of different organizations. I think they were mainly focused on maybe Fortune 500 companies, but I would imagine building a board at an association has to be just as discerning, but also varying in the talent that you bring on board, diverse in the ways and thoughts that you have coming into the organization. So I'm just curious, tell us maybe a little bit more around that area, specifically board governance and building boards. What some of those challenges you've come up against, or how you're looking at that.
Well, Aaron, even the frame of building a board, I think, has multiple definitions, right? On one hand, you build a board when you decide, and the organization decides who's selected for a board, right? Because then you're constructing the board. And what you've seen historically is that often these are popularity contests, or who has the longest resume, instead of what's hopefully a more modern shift, which is what are the strategic competencies that we need in leadership to accomplish what's in our cycle of priority? And then how do we balance that with diverse representation, right? And so the models of governance selection, I'd say, are evolving to hopefully be more focused on strategic priorities rather than just off of CVs. But so we could talk about that end of building a board. And then there's the other end of building a board, which is like, once you discover these leaders, right? What does it look like to actually build a leadership pipeline so that the board members you get at the apex of leadership have had hopefully some experience and background to be better leaders? And then once they're selected, what's the process of orientation and refresh and onboarding the board of a whole, so that they're ready to hit the ground running? That, like, the service in a nonprofit sector is a service-minded experience. It's a learning experience. And so we're providing that as a way to build as well. And so there's really sort of those dual dimensions to building a board that an organization needs to consider.
That's really great. I feel like, Lowell, you just opened up the fire hose on us on like so many different facets. Like, we have an hour for this show, right? No, we don't.
Well, she gave me a really good question.
That was great. I love it. One thing you picked at earlier in that was the diversity aspect. I think there is some sense of, historically, boards are built out of people, popularity contests, people within the industry. And we've had some great conversations around how we inject more business and entrepreneurial spirit. I'd be curious on what your recommendations are to boards in how they could diversify sort of their thinking outside of the industry, and how do they weave that into, sort of the group at the table.
I mean, I have a few responses to that. The first is that if the primary means of diversifying thought at the table is by how many people can we include around the table, then there's going to be a never-ending struggle to add more seats to the table, right? And so the only means of input and perspective building can't be the number of seats, and how do we fill them? So there have to be robust and meaningful and hopefully curiosity-driven avenues by which any board member is provided with broader perspectives than what they bring in. So we can leave that aside.
Yeah.
With that being said, like what you want around the table, right, is hopefully a variety of experiences and skill set and knowledge and qualities that are going to give a good balance. So you have differentiated points of view, you have differentiated perspectives that can not argue with each other, right, but certainly debate with each other, but all have at their heart the best interest of the mission of the organization. And frankly, Lucas, I think that means that you can think more broadly about who sits at the board table, right? Does it, while our organizations, our associations are member-focused organizations, does that mean the only people at the board table have to be members? Are there places that you could bring in outside voices that could provide other perspectives? Is the only signal of that which can be considered expertise seniority? Or can we balance that which is an experienced professional with the newer voices that we want to come in and consider? I mean, part of this, I think, is the challenge for many organizations, that they are embracing the concept of diversity without having the more meaningful conversations in a leadership aspect of how do we continue to verify with each other what are the diverse aspects that we need to see represented in our leadership. And then there's a whole hurdle once they even know that, of actually getting that onto the board.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Lowell, as you're saying that, and as Lucas can attest, to me being someone that can be a contrarian sometimes, can be someone that really values different opinions and thoughts, and really loves to hear that an organization is interested in that true diversity, especially diversity of thought, because a lot of people look at diversity in a lot of different ways. I'm curious, how do you help facilitate that in an organization, especially a lot of associations that are very deeply seated in their industries or trades? How do you help facilitate the individuals that are on the board to be open? Because it's different between saying that's what we want versus that's what we're willing to work with and massage and accept.
Yeah, I'd say 3 or 4 things to that I'll try to say them very quickly. The first is the basis of, are we forming organizational structures and leadership dynamics that are based off of a radically curious mindset, right? The job of the leaders at the table is not just to discuss and decide, it's to inquire and seek perspective and knowledge. And that inherently is going to mean that, like, what I know at this moment is not sufficient and I need to discover more. And that opens you to hearing varied points of view, right? The second is a real clarity around how you represent those voices and perspectives around the table, knowing what the different perspectives are you're going to need. You know, we talked in our pre-discussion around how our organization, many of the leadership selection systems are based off of a democratic structure, right? But the democratic structure that most people think about, because it's what they're aware of, especially for North American, US based, is the democratic structure of our country, whereas we're not electing leaders that should be coming in with personal platforms, right? We should be selecting leaders that can advance the platform of the mission of the organization. And so part of it, Erin, is I think actually have methodologies of leadership identification, clarification, selection, right, that seek the differentiated. And the last piece I'll say just quickly is there has to be a greater capacity for trying things, experimentation and piloting, so that differentiated ideas can be tested and not just discussed. And that failure at the right level is actually a place of learning, right? And looked at for how do we do better? Because when you say, you know what, we have 3 different ideas, we're going to pilot small group each of these in the next 4 weeks, let's see which, and let's like run forward the one that does. It shows that like you're not just welcoming ideas in, you're walking the walk, right? And not just talking the talk. But that's a very different innovation cycle that leadership needs to embrace.
Yeah, we use a mantra within our organization, and that is best interest of the organization, right? So not everyone has to win. Not every idea has to be the best, but we want to put everything on the table. We use words like puzzle pieces, put all those on the table, and then look through the lens of, you know, what is the solution that is in the best interest of the organizations? Not Lucas, not Lowell, not Aaron. The best idea should always win regardless. And I think that's where you have sort of a conflict sometimes with personalities. There are personalities who feel like their ideas are the best and they always need to win. And I'd be curious how often you get into working with boards and you realize it's not an issue of, is the strategy not right? It's just the board is maybe sometimes unwilling to accept or have enough self-awareness that, you know, their piece might not be the one that wins.
Yeah. Well, I think that often the conversations I have with the organizations we work with, when it comes to, in particular, the premise of winning, right? Winning is a losing premise, because in an organizational context where you're trying to advance the mission, whenever a single person or idea wins, it means you have a whole bunch that feel like they lost. And instead, like, the mindset has to be is that for what we know at this moment and for what we're trying to achieve for tomorrow, what are the right pieces of input that we collect and can translate to what that path looks like? And that is a process of continual consideration. And so even if a singular idea that someone expressed isn't the one that's chosen at this moment, it didn't lose, right? It means that for this moment, it wasn't the right fit one. And it doesn't mean we won't consider it in the future as the environment continues to change. At least what I find, Lucas, right now is that, especially when it comes to volunteer leadership, they want to feel heard, right? Like, they want to know that, like, their voice is being considered. And it doesn't mean that every voice is selected. And most often I see the points of disconnect, and there's far ends of the bell curve outside of this, but most often it's when either leaders were not asked for their input in a way that was meaningful. So, like, you're a leader, but we don't care what you say, right? Or they're asked for their input, but it's demonstrated that we asked, but we didn't really listen to it, like even consider it, right? And then it was an empty ask. And I think half the battle, right, is how do we have meaningful systems of input, of collaboration, of conversation, so that the consideration of all those inputs are on the table. And then collectively, the best choice is the one the majority. I mean, there's two enemies to progress, right? Unanimity and nostalgia, right? Because we remember things much prettier than they were, and we get paralyzed by having to have everyone on the same page. And we can agree that, like, neither of those are the things that, like, the majority point of view is going to hopefully be, if we trust in our leadership selection and what's going to lead us to the best possible future, then it isn't that an idea lost. It's for what we know at this moment. This is the idea that's going to lead us to that future. And we'll continue to have that conversation and that reflection.
Yeah. No, well said. It is sort of a natural struggle, right? Because you want to attract and assemble the the Avengers of a board, the best of the best, and typically those people who have excelled in their industry and have that industry knowledge are somewhat all sort of type A, headstrong, bulls, and you put them all together in the china shop, it's hard to play nice.
Well, I think that's the other key piece. If you got all type A's, did you really construct the board you want? I think you want introverts, right? You want the ones who are the reflectors that process and come back with the brilliance. Yeah. But to balance that, like, that dynamic, you also need to have a really clear structure of how you facilitate that time together. Right. That invites, not like, when a board, the only way a board gives input is whoever has the mic, they speak the whole time, instead of thinking about how do we take what we've learned from these more virtual dynamics and utilize in our boardrooms paired thought, small group thought, processing, where there could be multiple places of input that then surface the bigger ideas, so that the varied, like, extrovert, introvert, ambivert, all the verts, right, get a chance. Right? Like, that's what's going to lead to a rich discussion. That's what's going to lead to, hopefully, like, a richer narrative of what the future is we're pursuing and why.
It's so interesting. It's like you have the job of a political scientist, a therapist, a mediator, a coach, just trying to get people, because I think it's, we're talking about humans and a lot of different human aspects of people's behavior, but then also how does that work within the confines of a structure that's trying to get somewhere? And I do appreciate that you said nostalgia and what was the other? Yes. And it's true. And, even in our own system as government or anything, if anyone could just start thinking about trade-offs or what's the next best thing we can do to test and experiment, move on, and things like that. So I love those pieces of advice. Really super interesting.
Yeah. The idea of seeking to understand, not seeking to agree.
Yes. I think part of, if I could choose one skill set for our leaders that we would give them, I'd be hard pressed between inquiry or listening, but I'd probably choose listening, right? How do we help those elected to our boards to listen better? Right. Because if they listen to understand and not to reply, as Stephen Covey says, right? Priya Parker's whole thing around, like, listen deep enough so that what you learn can change you, right? Like, these philosophies of deep listening that I take from a philosophy from my company, right, of some strong core of curiosity, can totally change the premise of how an organization focuses and functions.
Yeah. And some of that is about asking the right questions, right? Sometimes those introverts that are sitting in the corner have some brilliant ideas. You just sort of have to ask the right questions and pull it out of them. And if you know how to do that and then listen to what's being said, you can learn a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes they're the best question askers as well.
That's right.
Radical curiosity, as opposed to what was the most recent book, Radical Candor, right? So radical curiosity. I love that.
Yeah, both.
Well, as usual, I have to be the beep, 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 catch us in and leave enough on the table to be desired so that we can direct our friends to you, Lowell, to get some more expertise here. And of course, next week, everybody tune into a blog to see what we pulled out of this. But before we leave you, we're curious who you might recommend to us in this new year, 2022, for us to speak to that might benefit our audiences.
Absolutely. Well, we are lucky and blessed in this community to have no shortage of interesting minds to speak to. But one that popped up on my radar today that I always look to is Alexis Redmond. She's with ASHA, and she just today was recognized by Association Trends, I believe, for their young and aspiring. And so she's definitely a voice of leadership in the community. Would recommend having her on.
I love that. Oh,
Excellent.
Great. Well, we thank you so much for being with us. And we know we had to reschedule and holidays were crazy, but what a fun way to kick off the year speaking with you about
Perfect way to start the new year.
topic.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Right,
I feel like we
before
should
Lowell takes
dedicate an
off and
hour,
picks
right?
up to his next destination tomorrow.
Right. Exactly. We'll have to come back and have like a meeting of the minds, because I could, of course, talk about this topic for a long time. I think it's so interesting. We'll have to maybe do like a sub episode on how can we help the world right now, even through some of this coaching. I think it's really relevant. So very, very interesting.
Thank you for the chance. It was a pleasure to spend time with you all.
Yeah. Thank you for being with us.
Pleasure, Lowell.